Trauma-related dissociation, its treatment. Trauma-related dissociation disconnects the person from reality and causes a great social imbalance. Trauma-related dissociation is a term that raises many questions and some misunderstandings. First, we must understand that it is not an expression of weakness, nor is it a pathological mechanism. It is an adaptive psychological response that helps individuals cope with a painful event. The human mind uses dissociation to separate the individual from the negative experience and thereby dull the emotional pain. But this sophisticated survival resource has a psychological cost. In fact, it can fragment the individual's memory and identity. It is a complex mental reality that we will explore in this article. Early detection of the presence of a dissociative disorder prevents the individual from developing serious behaviors, such as self-harm or suicide attempts. Trauma-related dissociation. Trauma-related dissociation is a neuropsychological defense mechanism that seeks to separate the individual from external and internal experiences in order to reduce pain. It blurs the person's memory and distances him or her from certain thoughts and feelings. If the memory of a dramatic event were constantly at the forefront of the memory, one would feel completely overwhelmed. A study by the University of Maryland, USA, suggests that the impact of this dimension has been neglected. They suggest that greater awareness of dissociative processes is needed because they correlate significantly with self-destructive and suicidal behavior. While it is true that this response seeks to protect the individual from suffering, a fragmented mind has enormous long-term consequences at all levels. Symptoms associated with dissociation. Trauma-related dissociation works by mobilizing different neurological areas to regulate the impression of the painful memory and the resulting suffering. The cerebral amygdala activates the production of cortisol, and centers, such as the prefrontal cortex, cease to function normally. The hippocampus, the center of emotional memory, also becomes dysregulated. It means emotional numbness, memory loss, and a reduced capacity for reflection reasoning. An article written by the University of Leiden, Netherlands, emphasizes that this mechanism is an extremely complex process that is present in conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative identity disorder, borderline personality disorder. It is useful to know how the symptoms develop: anxiety, suicidal thoughts, isolation of emotions, doubts about identity, persistent feelings of anxiety, sleep disturbances, such as nightmares, anhedonia or the inability to feel pleasure, self-destructive behavior such as self-harm, being unable to remember certain periods, disconnection from oneself or the world around one, going somewhere and not knowing how to get there, have flashbacks, brief memories of traumatic events, experience the feeling that many stimuli and experiences are not real. This form of dissociation falls within a spectrum. Therefore, some people experience only mild disturbances, while others suffer from a truly dysfunctional and painful quality of life. Types of trauma-related dissociation. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, the trauma-related dissociation can manifest itself in the following three ways. Dissociative amnesia. After one or more traumatic experiences, the person develops gaps in his memory and forgets certain fragments before or after the negative experience. Depersonalization or derealization. This makes the person feel that he or she is outside his or her own body. He or she also believes that what is happening or surrounding him or her is not real. Dissociative identity disorder. This condition was previously called multiple personality disorder. Patients who suffer from it assume different identities in response to trauma. An article published in the Journal of Mental Science claims that this condition is a severe form of post-traumatic stress. Furthermore, it is a complex condition to diagnose and treat. The origins of trauma-related dissociation. Trauma-related dissociation usually occurs after a superimposition of several traumatic events. It does not always occur after a specific event, such as the loss of a loved one. However, people who have been abused since childhood are at greater risk of developing this psychological defense mechanism. The University of Turin, Italy, conducted a study that claims that multiple traumatic experiences endanger mental functioning and dissociation occurs. The kinds of events that can trigger these harsh realities are as follows. Living in a war zone. Growing up in a dysfunctional family. Being mistreated or abused over several years. Living in a disadvantaged or unfavorable social environment. Witnessing violent events over a long period of time. Work for years in a threatening and highly stressful environment. Dissociation can give the person a feeling of going crazy and that everything is out of his or her control. The first step is to make the sufferer understand that this reaction is a normal mechanism in his or her brain to suffering, that it can be treated. Treatment of trauma-related dissociation. When treating trauma-related dissociation, the therapist always starts from the individual client's needs and special reality. As pointed out in an article published in the Indian Journal of Psychiatry, an appropriate diagnosis must be established that excludes other causes, possible comorbidities, and predisposing traumatic and personality factors. Let's look at the strategies used to deal with this reality and the useful therapeutic models. Strategies and treatments. Promote a healthy self-concept. Change harmful thought patterns. Develop healthy coping skills. Promote the ability for physical and emotional self-regulation. Reduce the constant over-activation of the central nervous system. Encourage the person to set new goals and meanings. Foster a connection to the physical sensations in the body as a way of dealing with emotional pain. Guide the client to accept the emotional pain associated with dissociation to gradually integrate his or her own identity. Makes it easier for the client to gradually process the traumatic experience. There is no reason for the client to revisit the traumatic memories. It is more appropriate to address his or her feelings and dysfunctional thoughts and create a healthier behavior. Appropriate therapies for dissociation. One of the most widely used therapeutic approaches to dissociation is EMDR therapy, or eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Research published in the Permanent Journal highlights that EMDR is one of the most effective treatments for all traumatic processes. Other therapeutic techniques that are helpful are as follows. Cognitive processing therapy. It is a practical model for dealing with cases of sexual abuse and mistreatment. Psychoactive substances. It is an alternative valued by doctors and psychiatrists in the ongoing treatment of emotional dissociation. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Thanks to techniques such as cognitive restructuring, emotional regulation, exposure to aversive stimuli, the client integrates his painful experiences. somatic therapies. These work from the idea that dissociation leaves a deep imprint of suffering in the physical realm. By dealing with sensations and somatic discomfort, the client's emotional pain is gradually reduced. Final recommendations. Dissociation is a useful mechanism in the mind, but in the long run it hinders our quality of life. It is true that there are certain memories, experiences, and images that should never return to our consciousness. But traumatic experiences must always be processed and integrated into the traumatized person's identity, so that the suffering becomes less. That is the purpose of psychological therapy. So don't hesitate to ask for specialized help if you need it. The trauma tape. The trauma bond keeps us attached to those who hurt, abuse and assault us. Find out where it comes from and why it is maintained. Have you ever known someone who is trapped in an unhealthy relationship that they can't get out of? Or have you seen how a person who was or is being abused by his parents insists on maintaining the connection between them and justifying their actions? Before judging those immersed in this type of dynamic, it is important to know how the trauma bond is created and how it works. We are governed by reason. Therefore, none of us wants to be mistreated or exposed to abuse. However, our brains and the mechanisms that regulate mental function are complex. Therefore, they can become our greatest enemies when it comes to leaving toxic relationships. This is even more obvious if we don't really understand how they work. If you want to know more about this type of relationship and the reality that victims experience, listen on the trauma tape. Humans learn to form bonds in early childhood through interaction with their parents or primary caregivers. Ideally, these adults provide them with the care, safety, and responsiveness necessary for them to develop trust and healthy self-esteem and bond in healthy interdependent ways. But when these people, with whom the child seeks security, are also their aggressors, things go wrong in the dynamic. The child grows up with the view that abuse is natural. Furthermore, they learn to relate via the dynamics of fear, humiliation or abuse of power. Furthermore, they cannot run away or set physical or emotional boundaries with their caregivers, as they are completely dependent on them. Therefore, they activate a number of psychological mechanisms to cope with a situation, which binds them to the perpetrator through the trauma bond. This happens when the parents abuse the child physically or psychologically, when they are narcissistic or neglectful, offer only conditional love or use full-scale manipulation. Since the individual's foundations are laid in childhood, it is likely that he or she will repeat these patterns in adulthood. In reality, these people relate to others via imbalance, low self-esteem and dependence. Furthermore, they tend to choose similarly narcissistic or abusive partners. The trauma bond is an addiction that occurs between two people in a relationship characterized by abuse, imbalance, and a sense of intense connection. An association with the perpetrator is created. In addition, a number of mechanisms take place. They perpetuate this dynamic and prevent the victim from leaving the relationship. Why do they maintain the trauma bond? When we ask why a person continues in this type of relationship, we can tend to oversimplify the answer. In fact, we may think it is due to economic, social or emotional dependence on the partner. But while these factors undoubtedly contribute, it is the bodily and cognitive processes that really maintain the trauma bond. In other words, it is the victim's body and mind, and what is happening within him or her that prevents him or her from leaving. The following elements usually have an impact. abuse cycle. In this type of relationship, a dynamic is often repeated that increasingly captures the victim and keeps them captive. It is known as cycle of abuse or cycle of violence. The tension builds up until it explodes into aggression and then subsides for a time. When the victim responds to an action by the perpetrator and wants to leave the scene, forgiveness, reconciliation, promises of change emerge. But the cycle will soon start all over again. Even if one notices that the pattern repeats itself, the satisfaction of the atonement and the effect of the periodic reinforcement make it extremely difficult for the sufferer to act. In effect, the person's executioner also acts as his or her savior. They cause great discomfort and provide relief at the same time. This creates great mental confusion and a trauma bond that becomes stronger and harder to break. Cognitive distortions. On the other hand, a series of prejudices and cognitive distortions take place in the victim as he or she tries to find meaning in his or her chaotic and painful experience. It is mainly cognitive dissonance that intervenes. It is a psychological tension that arises as a result of the abuse suffered. It ends in a series of justifications, rationalizations and other mechanisms that defend the aggressor, the relationship. A person with low self-esteem, insecurity and a high need for confirmation tends to undermine their suffering. He or she may tell himself or herself that he or she is exaggerating, that it is nothing special, or that he or she can make his or her partner change. This is reinforced by the manipulation, gaslighting practiced by the other party and by their repeated and empty promises of change. The biological dependence of ties. In addition to the above, it has been discovered that biology also plays a role when it comes to trauma ligaments. During primary relationships in childhood, the brain gets used to a certain pattern of bodily reactions. Consequently, it continues to seek the same sensations in adulthood via new relationships. As a rule, the person who had a childhood marked by trauma bonds experiences constant or repeated high levels of stress, cortisol. In addition, the release of endorphins that occurs as a result of episodes of aggression or stress becomes addictive. Therefore, in the future, this person will seek to establish relationships with similar dynamics that will make it possible to achieve the same reactions and thus regulate his hormonal levels. To the brain that has become addicted to these emotional and hormonal fluctuations, it seems almost impossible to leave the relationship. In fact, it is as complicated as overcoming drug addiction. How to escape the trauma bond. If a person is subjected to abuse, they usually tend to flee from the perpetrator and seek support in healthy relationships to achieve internal regulation. But in the case of the trauma bond, the person seeks security and an established attachment to the same person who carries out the violence. Faced with this internal tension due to inconsistency, the victim thus rationalizes and justifies what is happening in a certain addictive way, because it is impossible to escape from the situation. Since this relationship pattern often originates from childhood and is deeply rooted, psychological support is usually necessary to achieve change. It is not only about leaving the harmful relationship, which is of course important, but also about preventing what causes the person to continue forming relationships in this way. In conclusion, do not hesitate to seek professional help if you find yourself in this kind of situation. Understanding trauma triggers and how to deal with them. Trauma triggers are stimuli that activate the involuntary memory of past painful experiences. We give advice on how to deal with them. You have probably experienced that you react with anxiety and suffering when you see certain news stories on TV or on social media. In fact, these kinds of photos are shared daily. Sometimes they can make you react in an exaggerated way. In other words, with excessive and painful emotional intensity. They are known as trauma triggers. The human mind, when it comes into contact with certain stimuli, allows the memory of a negative event to be reproduced in a vivid and frightening way. It's like when you watch a movie and you become completely immersed in it. Quickly, your brain is flooded with fear, nervousness, and feelings of extreme distress. The main characteristic of post-traumatic stress is known as traumatic coupling. It is the process by which a negative experience is associated with a series of triggers that create an involuntary negative reaction. These can range from classic flashbacks to panic attacks. But why do these overwhelming emotional responses occur? Furthermore, what can be done about them? Let's find out. It is useless to try to suppress or give no meaning to the stimuli that cause you to remember painful events. If you don't address the roots of the trauma, the triggers will intensify. Trauma triggers, a bridge to emotional pain. Netflix occasionally puts up a warning that the series you're watching contains potentially disturbing images, e.g., sexual violence, drugs, suicide, etc. A significant part of the population carries some form of psychological trauma. In fact, a survey conducted by various universities around the world showed that close to 70% of the people surveyed claimed to have suffered such experiences. They were actually conditioned to the type of stimuli that could, at any time, trigger their previous pain. Trauma triggers are the involuntary memories that we experience when we come into contact with a psychological stimulus. For the most part, these stimuli are harmless and non-threatening. However, the psychophysiological response is intense and uncontrolled. It should also be noted that these phenomena have been studied since the 19th century. Trauma triggers don't just make the person feel sad or uncomfortable. In fact, they generate great emotional suffering. The sufferer may even experience the same physical sensations as when he or she experienced the trauma. The most common trauma triggers. The most frequent and intense trauma trigger is the smell. Doctors Eric Vermette and Douglas Bremner conducted a study that claimed that a particular smell can often evoke an intense emotional response. It can lead the individual directly back to their traumatic experience. Other common triggers are sounds. They act as direct bridges to memories of a stressful or painful past event. Flavorings. They evoke feelings and sensations that can activate the memory of a trauma. Textures. Specific scenarios or locations. They can be common places, e.g., a bathtub. Seeing certain faces that remind the sufferer of others related to the trauma. Watching certain movies, series, or being exposed to certain news. Bodily sensations, e.g., rubbing a sheet on the sufferer's body may remind one of an attack. Words, voices, and music. Internal trauma triggers. The affected person activates these with his own thoughts. Anyone who has been a victim of trauma can be exposed to a stimulus that repeatedly evokes the drama that they have experienced in their past. It is an uncontrollable phenomenon that causes great suffering. Cortisol keeps us awake when we have been exposed to negative experiences. This can make us permanently hypervigilant, constantly focusing our attention on possible threats. Here's how to treat these painful triggers. Many sufferers may strive to control their negative thoughts and feelings. They want to avoid the stimuli that in one way or another lead them back to something they do not want to remember. However, it must be understood that controlling or escaping from trauma triggers is futile if the original root of the painful event is not addressed. Furthermore, exposure to trauma triggers is a common strategy in the treatment of post-traumatic stress. In fact, it is one of a number of highly valid, and effective psychological therapies that enable those affected to regain their quality of life. Let's take a closer look at these therapeutic strategies. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy changes the client's dysfunctional thought patterns. Consequently, they are gradually giving way to more functional approaches. This makes it possible to reduce their suffering. There is a special cognitive behavioral therapy model with a focus on childhood and youth trauma, TFCBT. It has proven to be very effective in these cases. Prolonged exposure therapy. Prolonged exposure is another extremely useful psychotherapeutic resource for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. It is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that focuses on treating trauma triggers. The goal is to reduce the emotional impact of the memories associated with a negative event. To do this, the client is exposed to the memory of the trauma itself, both in an imagined way and in live situations. In fact, they are exposed in a safe and controlled way to the kind of stimuli that provoke an intense emotional response in them. EMDR therapy. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR therapy is one of the most recommended strategies in the treatment of trauma. It was developed by the neurologist Francine Shapiro in the 1980s. She based it on a number of hypotheses. The first was that certain types of eye movements promote a reduction in the emotional intensity associated with negative memories. In fact, they create a certain calm in the central nervous system. The second hypothesis is that through conversation and imaginal exposure to trauma, one can process these memories to reduce their impact and promote their integration. The importance of therapy in the treatment of trauma triggers. Any psychological strategy for treating trauma aims to enable the client to process, accept, and integrate his past trauma into his life. The goal is for them to be able to live with the negative event without the memory of it changing their life, well-being, and ability to relate. In conclusion, we can safely say that these therapies are effective and supported by sufficient scientific evidence. Therefore, you should definitely consider these therapies if you experience any of the trauma triggers described in this article. They are worth bearing in mind. Remember, you should never hesitate to ask for specialized help if you feel you need it. 7 of the most serious childhood traumas. The most serious childhood traumas leave lasting scars that usually affect the person's development in adulthood. The most serious childhood traumas usually result from situations where children perceive that their lives or important people in their environment are in danger. More specifically, their mother or father. Childhood trauma can leave scars that last a lifetime, especially if they are severe. Their intensity varies according to the extent of the damage caused, the frequency, the age at which it occurs, the psychological resources available, and the support provided. In this article, we explain 7 of the most serious childhood traumas. For a young child, violence is an overwhelming, uncontrollable, and horrific experience, and the emotional effects can last a lifetime. The trauma becomes internalized. It is what takes hold of us in the absence of empathy from others. Stephen Gross. 1. Emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is one of the most serious childhood traumas. It involves actions such as persistent verbal abuse, lack of affection, episodes of humiliation, contempt, etc. A 2016 study showed that this type of behavior causes changes in children's brains. 2. Physical abuse is one of the most serious childhood traumas. Physical abuse occurs when damage occurs to the child's body as a result of aggression from an adult. The most conservative data shows that 1 in 20 people have been exposed to this type of abuse during their childhood. This type of abuse makes the child, and later the adult, more vulnerable to external influences that can accelerate a mental or physical illness. 3. Sexual abuse. Another of the most serious childhood traumas is sexual abuse. It is a traumatic experience that children experience as an attack on their physical and psychological integrity. Furthermore, the consequences of this usually last a lifetime. This type of abuse includes any form of coercive sexual behavior by an adult that violates the integrity and privacy of a minor. Indeed, it must be taken into account that any sexual behavior, with or without physical contact, towards a child, is punishable by law. 4. Negligence. Abuse as a result of negligence or family neglect implies a failure to protect children. Their basic needs are ignored and they are exposed to potential risks. This neglect causes physical, psychological and social deprivation. That said, the consequences depend on the intensity of the failure, the risk factors present in the environment. 5. Violent abuse of the mother. Children who witness violent abuse against their mother are at an extremely high risk of developing health problems. In addition, they are more likely to use violence in their adult lives and are more predisposed to develop disorders, such as anxiety and depression. In addition, it is common for them to suffer from strong feelings of guilt for not having been able to help or save their mother. 6. Drug abuse in the home is one of the most serious childhood traumas. Abuse of psychoactive substances in the home is also one of the most serious childhood traumas. The Pompid Group, under the leadership of Dr. Corina Giacomello, conducted a study in this regard. The study points out that these children have a greater risk of becoming drug addicts in the future. In addition, they are more likely to suffer from mood disorders and psychological problems. 7. Imprisonment of a parent. Children who have a parent in prison not only lose the opportunity to have regular contact with the parent, but also experience higher levels of stress. They suffer from a sense of continuous loss and often find it difficult to form a coherent model of authority and family. It is common for this to lead to attachment disorders, post-traumatic stress symptoms or attention deficit disorders. What can be done to manage the effects of severe childhood trauma? As a rule, anyone who has experienced one or more of these most serious childhood traumas needs professional help. As an adult, they may not notice it, but it is these traces from the past that often prevent them from growing and moving forward in life. Ideally, all individuals who have been exposed to such experiences should be treated as soon as possible. The earlier the situation is addressed, the greater the likelihood that the trauma will have less decisive effects. Limbic system therapy for healing trauma. The limbic system plays an important role in the treatment of post-traumatic stress. Therefore, limbic system therapy is important in the treatment. Stephen Porges claims that the limbic system is the great conductor of the orchestra of emotions. He is right. For the same reason, limbic system therapy is an important part of the treatment of disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In fact, this center constitutes an extraordinary highway where emotions such as fear, sadness and anger can sometimes collide as a result of trauma. This means that the emotional accidents that tend to occur after a trauma have the potential to destroy the human mind. Trauma can be defined as an accumulation of remarkably negative events that, repeated over time, cause the victim to perceive himself as defenseless and develop thoughts, feelings and behaviors that enable survival, but generate extraordinary pain. For certain organizations, such as the American Psychiatric Association, however, there must be a life-threatening event in order to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. That said, the clinical reality suggests that less extraordinary events, but more repeated over time, are capable of inducing PTSD in humans. E.g., being sexually abused in childhood. The limbic system is the place where brain chemistry mixes with emotional experience, the place where the traces of our most significant experiences are created and preserved. Bessel van der Kolk. The limbic system and its connection to trauma. One of the fundamental factors in healing trauma is restoring the balance that exists between two specific areas of the brain. These are the areas that are specialized in the rational, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the areas that are specialized in the emotional, basic amygdala. The goal of such recovery is for people with PTSD to achieve the perception that they have control over their lives. Van der Kolk, 2020. This fact is particularly relevant since one of the effects that trauma exerts on the brain is the hyperactivation of regions specialized in emotion, the limbic system. As a result of this hyperactivation, patients react in a disorganized manner. For example, stimuli such as light, smell, touch, or a comment can be very intense for them. They induce a state of hypervigilance, similar to what we experience when we feel in imminent danger. This happens because during the traumatic event they coded such stimuli as dangerous, even though the danger may not exist at the moment. Van der Kolk claims that overcoming trauma involves finding access to the emotional brain. In other words, by subjecting the limbic system to therapy, we know that the neural circuits connecting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the amygdala are sparse, but they are connected to a third structure, the medial prefrontal cortex. This region is the core of what we know as self-insight. The goal of the intervention in PTSD is to restore the balance between these regions so that the patient is able to self-regulate. The limbic system is the emotional center of the brain, the place where feelings and impulses are born. Joseph Lee Dukes. Interventions for limbic system therapy. A multitude of interventions exist for healing trauma. The available evidence suggests that the best interventions gravitate around trauma-focused cognitive therapy. This may include elements of exposure, cognitive processing therapy, and EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. These interventions achieve the highest levels of evidence left parenthesis 1++ or 1+ right parenthesis, and the highest grades of recommendation. Iha Fonseca et al. 2020. Unhandled trauma is like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. Bessel van der Kolk. The goal is to reduce excess activation. Although pharmacology can help with this goal, it is well known that medication is far from curing trauma. On the other hand, it is known that 80 out of 100 fibers in the vagus nerve transmit information from different body regions to the perceptive and executive centers of the brain. This may indicate that the person who has been exposed to a trauma can train his body to reduce hyperactivation in the brain. To this end, both yoga and neurofeedback-based interventions have been shown to be beneficial. Van der Kolk, 2020. In addition, training in breathing techniques is a central element in the treatment of post-traumatic stress. This is because when patients use these exercises, parameters, such as their heart rate normalized. By normalizing their heart rate through a breathing exercise, voluntarily and consciously, they modulate their own parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for activation. There is no such thing as a single traumatic event. Trauma is always the result of a series of painful and heartbreaking experiences that accumulate over time. Judith Lewis Herman. Increased self-awareness after limbic system therapy. As a result of trauma, a person can develop a phobia of emotions. In fact, The feelings they experience can be so unpleasant, with noticeable symptoms at the body level such as tachycardia or a feeling of emptiness, that patients try to avoid them. As a result of this avoidance, their emotions grow and imprison them in a violent and cruel way. Therefore, in this context, it is important to promote techniques to increase their awareness of their feelings. As a result, much research is being done on this issue. Benefits have been observed in mindfulness-based treatment protocols, such as MBCT and MBSR. Among the beneficial effects, it is worth highlighting mindfulness' contribution to extermination of fear. Wagner et al. 2023. As can be seen, there is a wide range of interventions for limbic system therapy to heal and restore its balance with a rational brain. In this article we have taken a short tour of some of them. We have also provided a bibliography of prestigious sources. However, healing trauma is far from simple. That said, many researchers and mental health professionals try to help their patients on a daily basis. They understand that these people face a real challenge in this regard. Traumatized people are often afraid to feel. Now the enemy is not so much the author of the events, who hopefully will no longer be around to harm them again, but their own physical sensations. Bessel van der Kolk,